As I survey the political landscape, I notice a phenomenon that does not get talked about nearly as much as it should have, especially emerging from the political left, and that phenomenon is enemy worship. Enemy worship can be defined as a kind of apologism for the adversaries of a given society. And the adversaries are, of course, defined by the society they oppose. Their antagonism takes the image of the society they oppose. And I see a lot of that coming out of both the media and, of course, the institutional Democratic Party. And I think that it would do us very good as Americans, as thinking people, to try to understand the kind of ideological roots of enemy worship, why it happens, its justifications, and how we can defeat it and create a more unified political order. So in this video, we're going to go over that, and hopefully I'm going to be able to provide some enlightenment on this topic. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message is successful. We are building a movement of civic revivalism in this country. And if that vision is something that resonates with you, the vision of trying to revive the intellectual foundations of America, rooted in natural law, rooted in civil society, rooted in reason, rooted in understanding human nature, rooted in morality and obligation, all these kind of things, then I would implore you, please, be sure to support us. If you'd like to donate, that'd be nice as well. And of course, you can support us by liking, subscribing. Thank you so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, I think one of the more recent manifestations of enemy worship is the Obrego Garcia situation. Now, for those of you who do not know, Obrego Garcia was a illegal immigrant, or illegal, whatever you call him. I'm not sure he was an immigrant, so to speak, but he was certainly illegal. Immigrants implies a legal process. So he was certainly illegal. Came into the country illegally in 2012 and was deported by the Trump administration more recently in their crackdowns on sort of illegal entries into the country, which caused a massive firestorm in both the media and the institutional Democratic Party and the institutional left, and fed this narrative that President Trump was apparently targeting innocent Americans who are fathers, who are family men, and who are contributing to society, and therefore he was supposedly being inhumane. But in all reality, Obrego Garcia was a well-known, well-documented wife beater, beat up his wife numerous times, and his alleged gang connections to MS-13 are speculated to have influenced his wife's desire to defend him, despite being on record in police reports saying that she was being abused by him. As I mentioned, he entered the country illegally in 2012, so he shouldn't be here in the first place. And most importantly, he was implicated in human trafficking, illegally transporting illegals into the country and being paid by gang members to do so, amongst many other things. So by any measure, this guy is clearly not just a criminal, which is one thing, but he's a fundamental adversary to the American ethos, which is another. He has no respect to the core part of our ethos, which is the rule of law. He has no respect to one of the core social virtues, which is veracity, which is an allegiance towards the truth, without which nothing, whether it be society, whether it be human interaction, whether it be human behavior, can exist in an orderly and correct fashion. And not only that, but he has used his sort of affiliation, his sort of aesthetic of being a family man as a kind of way to shield himself from criticism, which also means he has no respect at all for authenticity, which is another thing. So he's clearly an enemy of American society. And yet, the Democratic Party and the legislative elite of the Democratic Party went to El Salvador, where he is now being held, and protested for him and attempted to make him into a rallying cry against the supposed inhumane, dictatorial, authoritarian deportation efforts of the Trump administration. This was the line. And then another example, I think, of enemy worship comes from CNN. Now, CNN actually interviewed a member of the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most vicious and also one of the most prominent drug smuggling organizations in all of Mexico, to ask them what they think about President Trump's deportation efforts. Right? It's asking a criminal what he thinks about the law being upheld, which is very, very interesting. And of course, CNN was widely panned by this, for this, and widely criticized for this. And the cartel member actually unexpectedly said that he was fine with the deportation efforts because President Trump was protecting his people. When a cartel member understands the virtue better than a journalist, you know something is terribly wrong. But both of these are examples of enemy worship due to the characteristics they bear. Now, as I mentioned, I define enemy worship in my intro as an apologism, a defense for the adversaries of a given society, and the adversaries are defined by the society they opposed, and it is a fundamentally values-based position. And so every society has different enemies. The enemies that America has is not the same thing as the enemies that the UK or the enemies that Russia has, because the societies are based upon different intellectual foundations. So a core part of enemy worship is not just behavior, that's part of it. It's also ideology. So there are several forms of enemy worship. The first form would be a sort of outward endorsement of a society or civilization's enemies. This is what we see on display with left-wing protesters and left-wing extremist groups like Antifa and other groups that openly praise people like Stalin, some people on the fringe left who praise people like Mao, many who praise people like Fidel Castro, so on and so forth. These are outward endorsements of people that not only despised the United States, but had moral systems, or rather immoral systems, constructed from false premises that oppose the betterment of humanity, that oppose moral excellence, in which no good civil society can exist. Fidel Castro, for example, was an outward Marxist. He had no problem killing dissenters. He had no problem sending dissenters towards their death. He had no respect for human expression. He had no respect for the ability to act towards your own conscience. He had no respect for conscience. All of these things which form the intellectual DNA of America. So those who engage in this form of enemy worship are rather blatant. They are rather, they expose themselves, and they can be easily called out, and they can be easily condemned. Now, there's a second form, and this is the form that CNN and the Democratic Party are currently engaging in, and this is the proximal support for people who are bad actors in the name of some kind of benevolent cause. So when you go towards a Sinaloa cartel member to make a deportation effort of criminals look evil, as opposed to opposing deportation on other grounds that would rather be sane. Because by the way, look, you can argue against deportation all you want. I may not agree with it, but there are arguments you can make against deportation, whether they're sound or not, that have nothing to do with flirting with bad people with bad characters. But when you decide to do that, you're engaging in a kind of proximal enemy worship, or like the Democratic Party did, like several of their leaders did, going down to support an outward wife beater, an outward criminal, someone who disrespects the rule of law in a society, going down to support someone who is engaged in illegal trafficking and immoral trafficking activities. You are trying to humanize inhuman behavior by proximity, by replacing the human involved, replacing the subject with a grand ideal. This is utility through idealism. And that's precisely what CNN was trying to do. That's precisely what the Democrats are trying to do. They're trying to idolize this idea of the innocent immigrant being attacked by the evil government, this sort of abstract archetype, and they're trying to then humanize it by giving it flesh with one person, despite the fact that if you look at reality and you let observation, not your imagination, guide your thoughts, reality would tell you this person is bad character, which is why it's always a bad thing to have a paradigm that is not connected with what is observable and what can be reasoned to be moral as well. And the third form of enemy worship is this sort of embodying ideas contrary to the health of human interaction for any purpose. So this is a kind of universal enemy that all societies have. Because whereas all societies have different ways of expressing their own norms and their own cultural affinities, all societies are based upon a set of core first principles that keep them together. All societies must have veracity, or else there will be no dealings in that society because no one can be trusted. All societies must have fidelity, or else everyone in the society can become an enemy like that in a split second. All societies must have justice, or else property cannot be defended. Life cannot be defended. Contracts cannot be defended. Covenants cannot be defended. Justice is the principle which safeguards what flows out of human interaction. It safeguards and ensures human interaction, so on and forth, so on and so forth. So any society, no matter where they are, must have these things, and when they do not, they suffer, they are constricted, and they become environments that are hostile to human growth. And so an enemy is, in the universal sense, is someone that opposes these virtues no matter who they are or what they are. So the problem with enemy worship is twofold, actually. The first thing is that, again, it's a form of relativism. It's actually a vicious form of relativism. It tries to humanize evil by proximity to virtue. The reason this doesn't work is because proximity tells you nothing about the content of a particular thing. If I myself hold an evil position, if I myself believe, for example, that humans can be weighed off of their IQ, or humans can be weighed, their value can be weighed off of what country they come from, so on and so forth, then I myself hold a position that is abhorrent. But my proximity towards somebody who does hold a good position, let's say I was proximal to someone like Mother Teresa, or any person, put a placeholder there, that would not redeem me of my bad belief. Of course, this is just an example. There are many other examples of this. However, relativism says there is no overarching standard, and you can be redeemed by anything because anything goes. There is a floating standard by which you think something can be applied to be valuable or not. So you can then associate somebody with something like they did with Abrego Garcia and then say that's a good thing. Well, it's a vicious form of realism because that's not really how you assess character. That's a bad way to assess character. That's a bad way to go about understanding morally right positions. Not only that, but enemy worship atrophies the social connections that the apologist has towards the people within society because it detaches them from any kind of duty or social benevolence within their native society. Someone who is clearly embodies vice and clearly does not care about the rules of the society, someone like Abrego Garcia, or anyone for that matter, when you're trying to protect them, you now have made a decision that you care more about the humanizing inhumanity, you care more about trying to justify vice, you care more about trying to rationalize evil behavior than you care about actually being a steward of truth and actually being a steward of sound behavior. Because the moment someone makes themselves an apologist for evil is the moment that their moral sense is corrupted and they can no longer engage in morally correct actions with other members of the society. How in the world can you be truthful when your positions that you advocate and argue for rest off of lies or half-truths? How in the world can you have a desire to be loyal to somebody when your sense of loyalty is not based on your relationships to them, it's not based on any kind of concrete action, but it is instead based upon an idealistic version of what you think is true, which actually rejects what the truth is? You can't. So enemy worship inherently makes somebody an antisocial enemy of civil society. It makes someone an antagonist to civil society. It also destroys sociability. Every human being, by virtue of being human, has what is called, what Grotius, the philosopher, called sociability, which is our desire to be in social relationships and our desire to act towards a way that actually preserves those relationships. And by, of course, the enemy worship putting you outside of the range of social virtues and putting you outside the range of correct principles and putting you towards the camp of somebody that clearly is a bad person or clearly has some defects, and you're able to rationalize those through some abstract idealism, so speculation, which is the next problem with enemy worship, that makes you and that literally deteriorates your sociability. So by harming moral duty, it also harms sociability and it makes you an antagonist. Moral action is triggered by moral connections. Moral action is triggered by relationships. This is actually the concept of Orderal Morris, which was a big debate recently about religion, but it's actually really a secular concept too, because I cannot be an American and be accounted for a family in China I've never met. But I can be an American and be morally accountable for my brother, my friend, my mother, my father, so on and so forth. The relationships I have and the relationships formed between me form the nature of my connections with somebody, and those connections themselves will then color what I should be doing for them or what they should be doing for me, independent of what we should be doing for everybody, which is, of course, being just, being truthful, being loyal, so on and so forth. But the moment, of course, enemy worship comes in, that chain link that forms between moral action and moral and obligation, it shatters. And what inevitably happens is a different kind of link of loyalty is created that has no connection with the people that are around you. So enemy worship, again, is very, very problematic for that reason. Now, the way to deal with enemy worship is not by being factional. And by enemy, I should specify, there's been a recent uptick recently in political discourse about the friend-enemy distinction. This idea that all politics can be reduced to this binary, factional, tribalistic relationship between friend and enemy, and nothing else matters. So good governance does not matter, higher principles does not matter, virtue does not matter. All that matters is who is your friend and who is your enemy. Not only do I think this is one of the worst ideas to come out of any kind of political thinking, because it reduces politics to a power struggle, as opposed to seeing it as simply seeing it as a way of applying ethics to complex problems that will allow us to live in a society that is a little bit more beneficial to human freedom and human flourishing, as opposed to being antagonistic to them by being restrictive and authoritarian. But it also defines enemy in a way that is really crude. Just because someone is in a different group than you does not mean they're your enemy. If someone is in a different group than you, but they actually share the same values as you, they should be considered more of a friend than an enemy. But this same short-sightedness can actually be flipped. And we can go from enemy worship to friend worship. I've noticed that a lot of people in America will worship certain allies we may have because they are supposedly our friends. And they will use that kind of worship to justify actions we do for them. So, for example, NATO. A lot of Americans will say, well, NATO is a collection of allies that are helping the Western world, and we ought to support the NATO partnership. We ought to have a president that supports the NATO partnership. Despite the fact that NATO is governed by a set of ideas that are universalists in the worst way, that impede national sovereignty for America, and most importantly, gear political considerations towards geopolitical objectives, as opposed to keeping moral and national objectives at the forefront. This is one of the reasons why a lot of NATO members actually wanted America to get involved in Ukraine, because they didn't really care about national sovereignty for Americans or what America's integral self-interest is. They care about maintaining a power monopoly in Europe against Russia. Now, you may say that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the point is that is a geopolitical calculation. It is not a moral calculation, and the actions of a nation must be based on number one, a moral principle, and number two, a desire to preserve their own people, as opposed to floating out and trying to deal with and preserve the fancies of those in the world. So friend worship, in the same way that enemy worship atrophies someone within society, it corrupts good moral sense, it corrupts our connection with each other. Friend worship, in the crude sense, can also do the same thing. I think that we need to check that out more as Americans. So, my friends, tying this all together, we have to be incredibly suspicious of any cause that takes us away from a concrete understanding of those in our society whom we are linked with, a concrete understanding of our country and our countrymen, a concrete understanding of what Cicero called the civitas, the commonwealth, the community we exist in. We must be very skeptical of any cause that causes us to fly away from that. We must also be skeptical of any cause that atrophies the principles of our humanity that are important to keep us in a sound state, in a moral state. Enemy worship, my friends, is insidious, it is vile, and it is, I think, one of the greatest internal threats our country faces. And any thinking American should reject it soundly, so that we put, instead of having abstract ideas govern us, we ought to have sound moral principles, we ought to have sound connections in society, and we ought to have sound virtue be our guide, especially when it comes to assessing the quality of certain people who should be in our society and should not be in our society. Once we return to that kind of rational observation assessment of these things, I believe enemy worship and its assorted bedfellows will no longer be a threat to society. But so long as we continue to entertain things that may not be sensible or may not necessarily even be good in the name of some cause, then I don't think we can have any moral core to begin with, and enemy worship is in itself one of the few of our problems we should deal with if we ever get to that point. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Join our Discord if you would like to. We are building a good community of thinkers. Be sure, if you also want to support me, you can donate to me as well. Thank you so much, guys. Study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.